For coming in. Now, our guest of the day, Tom Crotty, is the director of Ineos, which, amongst other things, is a major player in the emerging shale gas industry in this country. Fracking for shale gas is, of course, controversial. According to its supporters, it will create jobs, boost economic growth and bring down energy bills. But critics say it will damage the local environment, lead to more carbon emissions and distract us from focusing on renewable energy. The government has been enthusiastic about fracking for years, but despite that, the industry hasn't really taken off just yet. Let's take a look at George Osborne making the case for fracking at PMQs back in 2015.
We will have the proper environmental standards around the exploration of shale gas. But I think for this country to turn its back on one of these great natural resources which other countries are using would be to basically condemn our country to higher energy bills and not as many jobs. And frankly, I don't want to be part of a generation that says all the economic activity was happening somewhere else in the world and wasn't happening in our country and wasn't happening on our continent. So we should get off with the safe, environmentally protected exploration of our shale gas resources.
George Osborne there in the House of Commons. Well, the Green MEP Molly Scott-Cato is here. Welcome to the programme. Just before I come to you, there's been so much noise about fracking over the last few years. Both George Osborne and David Cameron were very keen supporters of it in the last government. So why has it not taken off?
I think because we're taking a very cautious approach. We are starting, we've been doing seismic testing. We're starting to hopefully do some test drilling this year. But we've got 2 more years of scientific work before we are in a position where we'd want to actually start doing this commercially. And that's because we're taking an extremely cautious approach. It has to be done safely, it has to be done well.
Or you've been blocked from actually being able to do it. Because I think most people, including myself, thought it would have started, the actual fracking procedure would have actually started, rightly or wrongly.
No, I mean, actually the licences from the government for the 14th round awards were only issued late last year. So we haven't had very long before we can start.
Is that a relief to you, Molly Scott-Cato?
Well, it is. I mean, I think the fracking industry is in real trouble on all sorts of fronts. As you said, there are concerns about local environmental impacts, and we agree with the Environmental Audit Committee that until we're absolutely sure it's safe, we shouldn't go ahead. But more importantly, at a global level, we know that the fracking industry is part of the fossil fuel industry, and we know that 78% of shale gas has to stay in the ground if we're going to have any chance of meeting the 2-degree climate change limit. And so this is really an industry that doesn't have any place in our future, and it's also now, according to government figures, turning out to be more expensive than renewables.
Right. I mean, do you accept that actually it doesn't in the long term have any place in our future because we should be focusing on renewables to actually bridge the gap?
No, I don't. I think we should be focused on renewables, and companies like ours are actually producing the building blocks for the renewable industry. I mean, we make turbine lubricants, we make the raw materials for solar panels, all of that. But we actually have to have more gas in this country, as a bridge technology, and I see that as a long bridge. That's 30 or 40 or 50 years of bridge. What that gas will do in the UK is replace imported gas. That imported gas is higher in terms of CO2 emissions because it has the CO2 associated with the imports. So we'll get a lower CO2 from our own gas than we do from imported gas. And we'll also be able to eliminate coal. And gas is half of the CO2 emission of coal. So I think to argue that says we don't need this gas on a CO2 ground is entirely wrong.
Right.
No, I don't buy that argument at all. I mean, the gas that's coming in is actually displacing other gas. But the point is that the fracking industry greatly underestimates the amount of leakages there are from its technology. And the leakages are of methane, which is much more serious in terms of its climate effect than natural gas. And I also think it's important to say that we need to reduce our demand for energy altogether, particularly by improving the quality of our housing stock.
But if the environmental protections could be guaranteed, you said at the beginning that actually, well, you implied that fracking would be all right. If there could be guarantees and there could be reassurances that any damage or any impact on the environment would be limited and it would be safe, then...
Well, I'm not convinced of that side, but the more important argument is around climate change and our need to move beyond fossil fuels. And renewables, because their fuel is effectively free, they are becoming cheaper all the time. And government figures from the business department showed that in 3 years' time, renewables will be cheaper than fossil fuels, and by 2025 they'll be considerably cheaper. So I don't think consumers should be made to pay, and I don't think we should also be subsidising fossil fuels to the tune of £6 billion a year.
Right.
The reality, of course, is entirely the other way around. We are absolutely massively subsidising renewables right now. And to argue that we're not, I think is futile, because that's the reality is we are, and at the moment the issue for me is renewables are not able to do the job. We are getting less than 15% of our power from renewables today, and 0 of our heat. 85% of the homes in this country are heated by gas. That cannot be replaced by renewables today.
Are you saying that renewables aren't subsidised?
No, I'm not. But renewables are a new technology, so they should be subsidised. Fossil fuels are subsidised because of vested interest, not because they're.
But you do. But the consumers are paying a large bill for the subsidies that are given to renewables on the basis, if you take Tom Crotty's point, that it isn't guaranteed, that it isn't consistent, that it's still quite a low percentage of our actual energy.
It's about half the level of subsidy that goes to fossil fuels, and I think most people will be shocked about that. But this point about intermittency. This point about intermittency is actually rather an old argument, because even the boss of the National Grid now is saying what we need is demand management of our energy supply, and that's a direction in which renewables are much more able to provide what we need than fossil fuels.
I mean, does fracking really answer the question of weaning people off high energy consumption? I mean, isn't that the way forward? And renewables will fit that picture much better than fracking would.
I don't see that. I think people will use energy regardless of its source in the same way. I think the issue is, I agree entirely that demand management is the most effective way to reduce carbon emissions in the long run. So demand management has to come first, but it's by no means the only solution.
But if we're going to have to significantly decarbonise the energy industry over the next few years because of our commitments made under the Paris Agreement, why move to fracking? I mean, if, as you say, it's still another few years down the line, although you claim it would be a very long bridge, 30 or 40 years, if we perhaps subsidise renewables even more at this stage, could we not move to it much quicker?
Well, the answer is no, because we don't actually yet have anything like the capacity, and we don't have the technologies either. I mean, at the moment, we cannot store electricity in a meaningful way. We haven't yet got the technology to do that. That is still some way down the track. When we get to the point where every window in a house is a solar panel, when every wall is a battery, then you'll get to that. But we're still tens or 20s of years away from that.
So do you not accept that this is the best way to make that transition? That
Absolutely
fracking could
not.
answer the question of transition? If we don't have the technology to store huge amounts of energy, then for the time being, fracking actually provides that bridge.
You would expect that kind of argument from somebody who was supporting fracking, but I
Sure.
absolutely don't accept it. What fracking is doing
Why
is...
don't you accept?
because
Which
it's
bit don't you say? Can we store huge amounts of energy at the moment?
Storage is improving rapidly, and the point is we need to focus on that.
How much do we store at the moment?
I haven't got the figures in front of me, but my argument is that if we subsidise fracking, if we continue to have planning in favour of fracking and against wind power, if we continue to subsidise an energy that's very unpopular, only 17% of people support it, we are diverting away from the investment of renewables that we need.
Right, you say planning's in favour of fracking, but we haven't yet seen any fracking actually taking place. So it can't be that much in favour of
The
it.
government has tilted the playing field in favour of fracking by saying that an appeal can be made above the local level, whereas in the case of wind power, it's balanced, it's turning planning against and undermining wind power.
Molly Scott Cater does have the public on her side, because the most recent poll, I think you said 17%, we have 19% of people in favour of fracking. That's very low.
It is low. It's actually changed for the first time in all the polling that's been done over the last 6 or 7 years. It's actually slightly moved back in favour of fracking for the first time.
By how much?
By a very small amount. But one of the fundamentals here is that there is a huge amount of misinformation out there about the impact of fracking. One of the challenges we have is going out into local communities, holding public meetings where we're basically saying, come along and find out the facts. We're actually now finding we've got people who are... we had a cancellation of a public meeting 2 weeks ago by a local community because they were being bombarded with abusive phone calls threatening them that if they carried on with the meeting and invited us along, there'd be all sorts of problems. Now, that isn't democracy, that's anarchy, and I think we have to have an open debate on this.
Well, it is a very divisive subject, and that's because local communities don't want this dirty industry in their backyard.
We're not
in Rotherham, I know there's a very strong protest against what Ineos is doing there, and I'm afraid, this sort of industry divides communities compared to renewables, which can be owned by communities and can really bring social and environmental benefits as well as economic benefits to those communities.
And I think the economic benefits that will flow from this industry are massive for those local communities, and that we have to prove.
Still divided at the end, but thank you for coming in. Now, at 30 years old, it's frankly, that's not